Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue à les Jeux olympiques du monde. Je m'appelle Rebecca. Je suis votre hôte aujourd'hui. Et je pense que it's day 12. 12. Jour 12 de les Jeux olympiques du monde. Welcome to everyone. Welcome. So this is day 12 of the Sales Olympics. I hope that everyone is doing well out there in LinkedIn. Look at how scary that is. I can't imagine diving into water from that high up. I remember doing it once as a little kid, and I was like, I'm never doing that again. So welcome to everyone out there in LinkedIn land. I saw Alex Smith's comment on the nice opener. So as much as I would love to take credit for that, that is actually all men. Men put together all of the opening videos. And I was like, men, I like watching these videos, these opening videos, like in my free time. I just put them on in the background. So anywho, thank you for the compliment, Alex, and good job to Mint on the opening videos. Okay, so today we have a spicy topic. Today is going to be how to create new urgency and new buyer intent out of thin air. Look at that. That was not intended. I have a fan on below me. But this is going to be a topic of when there is no buyer intent necessarily, you're going outbound. How do you create buyer intent when none exists? Or how do you create more buyer intent when some exists, but it's not enough to mobilize them to buy? So before I go into that, if everyone would jump in the chat, I see we've got some comments going here. Kirsten, hello. Ian, Gianluca, if everyone would pop in and say where they're coming from, dialing in from the world. I've noticed we've had a lot of European, international crowds, non-US crowd coming in. So I want to know where everyone is coming from. Gianluca, I think you're in Italy, if you don't mind me asking. Thank you very much about the red watch, Federico. Is sponsored by Adidas. Just kidding. Adidas doesn't sponsor me, but thank you very much for the compliment. So we're going to dive in here, but if you could just jump in the chat, tell us where you're coming from, tell us what your role is, your company is, who your buyers are, questions that you have. More questions and comments, the better. We got Doug being in from Vermont. Okay. Still Cape Cod on vacation. Lori just jumps in here to make us all jealous. She's like, hey, everyone, I'm living my best life in Cape Cod. So I actually saw an American yesterday. Yeah, I like how I mentioned American like it's an alien at this point. My friend April Terry came in from out of town for the Olympics. She's worked for HubSpot. Now she works at Active Campaigns. We had dinner last night. So it's really fun to get kind of a touch of home. But anywho, okay, we're going to dive in here, no pun intended, to how to create buyer intent out of thin air and lap number 1. So just as a reminder, it's 4x400 relay. I have 400 seconds to talk about each one of these 4 topics. So object in motion stays in motion, object at rest stays at rest. The punchline is that Newton's first law is going to come in very heavily when it comes to prospecting, oddly enough. So what this means is exactly 2 things. I want you to take object and just put the word prospect. So a prospect in motion stays in motion, and a prospect at rest stays at rest, unless enacted upon by an outside force. So let's take the latter half of the statement first. An object at rest stays at rest. So this is going to come in terms of outbound. So when you're approaching someone on outbound, simply put, you're going to a group of users typically, or a group of prospects that are at rest, meaning based on what they know, the problem's not big enough to actually do something about. So the difference with pain and problem is pain is a negative experience and problem is something that you actually do something about. You mobilize to solve or solve for. So all pains aren't problems, meaning all pains I'm not going to do something about, and all problems, things I'm doing something about, aren't painful quite yet. So sometimes I have no pain in the present. I just have the fear of what's going to happen if I don't solve for it right now as is. And so that's a solve for situation. So this object at rest stays at rest. This is typically going to come into play in terms of outbound. So your prospect, they're based on what they know, based on what the business problem is, the size of the business problem, or the size of a tactical problem, or the delta between where their leading indicator should be and where they currently are today. If that's big enough and it's causing a business problem, meaning a delta between their lagging indicator, where they are and where they need to be. So let's take, server uptime, for instance, for an IT director. If that delta is big enough, they will mobilize to do something about it. But that delta, as is regardless of how big it is what the pain is. So in server uptime, let's say, for the IT director, and that's their North Star. So for everyone who's tuning in live, that this is your first session. If you wouldn't mind, go in the chat and let me know if this is your first session or if you've seen some of the previous sessions. But pain, and we've covered it pretty in depth in some of the opening episodes, the pain is going to be the gap of their lagging indicator, meaning their final metric of where they are, where their current achievement is, and where their internal goal is. So for server uptime, that's going to be an IT director's lagging indicator. So the pain is, where is their server uptime goal versus where is their current server uptime? So common for server uptime is 99 and 3/9. So that's what they aspire to achieve. So let's say that the internal goal for them as a buyer persona is 99% uptime, and they're at 95 or 97 on average. So the pain, even if they're at 97, the pain is 2% server uptime. Probably not something they're actually going to do something about. 95% up is server uptime. It would be a 4% pain of server uptime. That's the pain. It's the delta between where they are and where their goal is internally, not where they want to go, because then they're just going to say 100% server uptime, but where the goal is. So if we pick customer success, their lagging indicator is client renewal. So their customer renewal goal internally is 95% customer renewal, and they're currently at 93%. So the pain, so to speak, is 2%. So the point of that is there pain there in that case scenario? Yes, but it hasn't actually become a problem, meaning something they're going to do something about. Because based on the level of pain and based on the level of impact that they know at this point, it's not worth doing something about. So something becomes worth doing something about whenever something trips, almost like a trip bar or a tripwire, where the impact either becomes large enough or the pain becomes large enough, right? So based on what they know, this object is at rest. So what that means when you're going outbound, that you're going to a group of users that are at rest based on what they know. So the biggest faux pas, the biggest mistake that I see, in my opinion, in going outbound is people talk all about the pain. They're like, we work with people who struggle with this. We work with people who struggle with server uptime. We work with people who struggle with employee retention for HR, customer retention for customer success. And even if they admit to that pain, yes, I have that pain, or if they're like, I'm someone who struggles with that, very likely, if it was bad enough, they would have already done something about it. So what you have to do to propel someone into motion in the first case is you have to find something that they don't know. So based on what they knew beforehand, they were going to stay static. But based on what you diagnosed that was new, they're actually going to propel into action. So industry average close rate for outbound into close one is 6%. If I had to guess why, it's because it's mostly you're going to people, even if they agree to a meeting on outbound, it's not bad enough as is. So they're just doing their due diligence in case it ever does become bad enough. But your goal in that room is to diagnose things they don't know. So if you come up with impacts that they didn't know, or root causes that they didn't know, or tactical problems that they didn't know, all of a sudden they're going to do something about it now because they know something new. So the first case, an object of motion stays in motion. This is the indecision bucket. Your buyer has already started to do something about it. So they're like, this problem's bad enough. And they will stay in motion and they will actually close unless enacted upon by an outside force. So the outside force in the first case was you diagnosing things they didn't know. They were static, and the outside force, you, propelled them into motion. In the second case, they're going to close unless enacted upon by an outside force like procurement, legal, amount of stakeholders that their eyes are on this decision, their fear that they're not going to actually achieve the outcome. So it's going to stay in motion unless one of those rises and slows them down to where they say, I want to solve for this, but I think that I'm going to mess up in doing it, so I'm going to stay put. That's the general rule on motion. So we haven't quite gone into how to propel them and create buyer intent out of thin air, which we're going to go into next lab. But just kind of as a summary, object in motion stays in motion, meaning if a buyer is going to buy, they've taken a first discovery call with you, especially if they're inbound. I would say that's someone in motion. They've decided to do something about it, unless enacted upon by an outside force, meaning procurement, legal, internal stakeholders, the likelihood that they can't solve the problem, their resources internally decrease, and that might slow them down. That friction might slow them down to a standstill, which we're going to cover more in depth in the third lab. But the second case is an object at rest stays at rest, meaning if they aren't actually already doing something to solve for it, they're going to stay in that state of not solving for it unless enacted upon by an outside force, which is you coming in to diagnose something new. So that was a very technical explanation. Y'all got back after a really strong sleep. So I'm going to punish everyone with technical explanations. If y'all could, being in the chat, let me know you're alive. Ryan, how's it going? He's coming in from London. My wife, Erica, is an HR consultant. That's amazing. Hi, Erica. Welcome to the Sales Olympics. She's probably like, what are the Sales Olympics? So if y'all have a question, if there's any kind of comment, would you recommend, Justin Juspington here, would you recommend pointing out a horizontal impact and outbound to get the buyers into motion? It's a brilliant question. So we're actually going to cover that in the next session. But hi, Jonathan. Jonathan, I forgot to text you back. I'm really sorry. Sales Olympics I've been taking very seriously, so I forgot to text you back. But thanks for the comment that you left on the YouTube video. You made my day by being into the video. So Justin, we're actually going to cover that in the next section. But the punchline to his question, so everyone on the line who didn't see it, he said, would you recommend pointing out a horizontal impact to get the buyer basically to propel into motion? So the punchline is yes, but the way you do it is very important. So the way you do it is that you have to diagnose for them in specific first that it's actually happening for them in specific. So I wouldn't rush in to point out something unless you're positive that you know that it exists. Usually you're going to need some internal information to understand, does it truly exist for them? But once you find it, yes, that's basically the goal of the conversation, whether they do something about it or not. That's what's going to get them into motion, like her. Okay, let's go into lap 2. Lap 2 is, so we're going to double down on the use case that they're static, meaning they haven't done something about it yet. So this is going to come into play in two case scenarios. Either you're going outbound or for a lot of your postbound leads. So postbound leads are basically anyone who's engaging with your marketing content but hasn't become a hand raiser, which is, of course, Justin, a postbound lead is they're engaging with your marketing content, but they haven't become a hand raiser. So a great example would be content downloads or webinar registrants or blog subscribers, newsletter subscribers, any kind of freemium users that they've used a free version of your product but they haven't upgraded, or any kind of they're engaging with you on your company page on social media. So these are people, even if I'm downloading a piece of content that says something about like how to hit more quota, but I haven't raised my hand, it means that I'm not convinced of something. I'm either not convinced that the problem is big enough, or I'm not convinced that it's you that can help me solve it, right? One of those two case scenarios. So usually in this case scenario of they are staying static, it can be a combination of the two. So I'm not trying to get someone out of their chair to get them out of the chair's sake. I'm trying to get them out of the chair if it's worth them getting out of the chair, but they didn't know why. So, a great example of this, and I mentioned one of the earlier episodes, is I was told by my dentist that I need to get an electric toothbrush for years and years and years and years and years. But I never did until my most recent hygienist, when I came in, showed me pictures of my gums receding over time because I'd brushed so hard. And she let me know that if I were to continue brushing in the manner that I was, as much as I was 5 times a day, and as hard as I was, then I would have no gums in my 40s. And they would have to graft some of the top of the upper top of my mouth. They would have to pull some of that gum out of there and replace it around my teeth because you don't grow in new gums. Or they could get gums from somebody else's mouth, which is my personal hell, honestly. The idea of that. So she found an impact that I didn't know. So beforehand, I was static as can be. Afterwards, all of a sudden, there's a new impact that I didn't know about. So that's what mobilized me to buy, right? So if you're going after and you're trying to sell someone on a product, the first thing they need to be sold on is that they have a problem that's big enough. So the problem is only the size of the current effects, the pain, plus the impact. So I would go after finding either a tactical problem, root cause, persona, horizontal, or vertical impact that are current, but especially persona, current, or horizontal impact in the future that's going to happen to them if they don't do something about it now. So if someone had gone to CrowdStrike beforehand and had predicted what's going to happen to them, and you can predict by asking their leading indicator questions. For instance, how many developers do you have? How many lines of code do you have in your database? How many of those lines of code are reusable, meaning you can use them in another product? How many beta tests are you doing on average? How many product launches do you have coming up? What percentage of the time are you actually reusing code? What's the process to approve pre-existing code? So if I rush in there and I find out that they only have 5 developers and that they have 3 product launches coming up, I'm already starting to do the math is that's not enough developers. So they're going to have to give essentially they're not reusing code because they can't service it fast enough. So they're going to have to create all that code from new, and they have to do 10,000 lines of new code per feature, and they have 5 features per product, and they have 5 products that are coming up. I'm like, that math isn't working out. So they're going to have to sacrifice on something. What they're going to have to sacrifice hypothetically on is beta tests. So the North Star for a developer is critical bugs. One of the lagging indicators. So I'd be asking a certain amount of questions to understand for them, this is going to issue in probably around 10 bugs per product. And statistically, the likelihood is very high that one of them is going to become critical. So whenever I spring into their buyer intent, they have no or limited buyer intent based on where they are pre-internet shutdown, right? But how I create new buyer intent out of thin air is I create a new problem. And how I'm creating a new problem is not coming up with a problem that doesn't exist. It's by diagnosing one that exists that they don't know about, right? So my hygienist that day didn't create a new problem for me. She didn't make my gums recede more. All she did was put up the graphics of what has happened over time to my gums and then prognose what happens if I roll forward without changing anything as is today. So I said, how do I change this? And she said, well, we can either go through the painful surgery or you can buy an electric toothbrush so that you won't brush as hard. So I bought the electric toothbrush, 0 buyer intent before, 100% buyer intent afterwards, right? So how I'm creating that is first I'm diagnosing what they believe the problem to be. Let's say that the problem is the size of France, pretty big country. That's what they believe. That's what they're going to operate and buy based on is the size of the problem that is France. France is not a problem. It's the opposite, by the way. Pas de problème. But the actual size of the problem is all of EMEA. So what I'm doing first is I'm finding out what do they believe and why do they believe it. And the second thing that I'm doing is I'm actually diagnosing the things that they didn't know, so that once they become aware, they're going to buy a solution based on the problem that they didn't know that existed beforehand. So they didn't have buyer intent before, but now they have buyer intent because of the new problem. Another example that comes into my mind for some reason is, has anyone seen the movie Armageddon? It's going to date y'all if you have seen this or haven't seen this. So Armageddon, Bruce Willis, Ben Affleck, Liv Tyler. I loved that movie when I was growing up. So basically, let's see if anyone is going to come into the chat and admit it. But Armageddon, basically, what the punchline of the movie is there is a meteor coming for the Earth. Big, fat meteor. Oh, Justin, we're on the same page. So there's basically a meteor coming for the Earth that's going to collide with the Earth and it's going to, wreck mankind. So the interesting thing is the point that they come across the meteor is the point where they believe they start to solve for it. Now, that meteor must have existed, hypothetically, for quite a while. But the point that they started to solve for it was the point that it came across their radar. So the question I'm asking, if you want to create new buyer intent, which if you're going outbound, you're going to have to, for them to close, for them to prioritize it, you have to keep in mind, you're going to a group of people who haven't prioritized it themselves. So if you want them to prioritize it, you're going to have to create new buyer intent. To actually create new buyer intent, you're going to have to find what meteors exist in their orbit that are going to collide with them and sometime soon, but they are unaware of it. Their radars are pointed in a certain direction, So heaven forbid, like I run quite a bit. Sometimes I've almost run into a car. It wasn't because I hope that I'm dumb. It wasn't because I wanted to run into a car. It's because I didn't see them coming, right? I didn't see a motorcycle coming. And so I step out with the belief that that motorcycle is not coming down the road. So the person who's behind me, who sees the motorcycle and pulls me back, that is going to be the person. That is the seller, hypothetically. That is the role of the seller, is not to sell them on their current reality, what they believe, what's the cost of not doing something about that. It's to diagnose something they don't know so that they can show the buyer what's the actual reality of staying as is that they didn't know about that's rolling forward, right? So unknowns is where I'm going to live, breathe, eat, and die. So let's go into lap 3, Bruce on the stone. I watched Armageddon. I watched Titanic 27 times in the theaters when I was little. That should tell you alone that I had some issues, right? I think there were 9 mistakes in the Titanic movie. I think he mentions at one point that there's a river that exists that he went fishing at that didn't exist yet. I'm like, Leo, do some research here. Do some research here. So this third lap, an object in motion stays in motion. This is someone has actually made a move to do something about it. They're like, the problem's big enough. So this is anyone who comes inbound who's like, I'm going to actually solve for this problem. And they're going to stay in motion unless enacted upon by an outside force. So the things that you can do in the first case, it's how do we get this, football, let's say, it's still, how do I get this collide with this force, with this point of impact that they didn't know about, to where they start to go into motion. The second case is they're rolling towards the goal unless enacted upon by an outside force. So these forces, and these are going to be the lion's share of your deals. So this is indecisive deals. So 40 to 60% of the time, you're going to lose your deals to indecision. And I cannot harp enough on this topic, because in both case scenarios, your buyer is afraid. In the first case scenario, what sellers are trying to do is they're trying to use that FUD, or that fear, uncertainty, and doubt, in the ROI case to drill up the fear of what they'll miss out on, the return that they'll miss out on if they don't buy the product. In COI selling, which is the more manipulative one and the more toxic one and the more dangerous one, is they're trying to get the buyer to admit things of what will happen to them. What's the impact to you? What are the ripple effects? To calculate the cost of not springing into action so they can increase the fear of what happens to them if they stay still. And then they try to discount. What's the fear of if we offer this discount right now, but the fear is it might go away. They might not be able to buy this for an extended period of time at this price. So this is when you see end of quarter discounts or end of month discounts. In this second case, their bigger fear is that they're going to mess up. So this is where omission bias comes in, which basically it boils down to people have a massive fear of messing up and that they're going to have to take accountability for that. And this fear outweighs what's going to happen to them if they stand still. So you have to keep in mind, even if they come out of the meeting and they say, oh, we want to solve this and the problem is big enough to solve and and this is who we're going to get involved. 90% of their time is spent when you're not in the room. And so if you just get them to talk about their pain or something emotional, that's in child or parent ego state, and it's going to wash up with the tide. Their fear at this point is not that the problem isn't big enough. Their fear is that it is big enough, but they're not going to be able to solve it. So they're better off staying still because then they keep their credibility, they keep their money, they keep their expertise, they save face. So the problem remains the same, but at least in this case, they haven't lost credibility and lost money. And there's a chance that it might not actually become true. So omission bias is going to play in heavy here. That's why people are introducing multiple stakeholders at this point. I mean, it's getting ridiculous. There are 15 people in a mid-market deal. And the reason isn't because they want everyone's buy-in and opinion. The reason, if I had to guess, is they want shared accountability. If this thing doesn't work, I want 15 people to join in and say that I agree with it, right? So that it's not just me that's actually taking this toll. So you have to keep in mind that fear is valid. Usually they don't actually get the outcome that they wanted. Usually they actually can't use this thing to solve the problem. And the reason is they're scared of that they haven't chosen the right solution. There's too much information for them to sift through to actually find the right solution and how to use it, and that they won't achieve their outcome. That fear is valid. And instead of addressing that fear or trying to get that fear to go away or trying to handle that fear or size up that fear or say like, okay, let me limit the exploration so that they don't run off because of that fear, or how do I get detached from my outcome to get them to feel more at ease with me, to feel like I'm not trying to close them so that they actually open up so I can close them, which is even worse. I would help them with that fear. And the way I help them is by diagnosing things they don't know. So their confidence rises in one of two things, or one of three things really, that you will help them actually solve it if they buy it, use this product to solve it, that you are able to help them in their exact situation, because if you came up with all these things they didn't know, they believe that the delta between you and them from an education perspective is bigger than they thought originally. So they're like, I can't really help solve this problem. I'm not an expert in this field, but this person is, this seller is. Their fear that your agenda is not to help them goes down because all of a sudden you're proving through your actions that your agenda is one and the same with them. But the last one, in the worst case scenario, if they don't buy from you, that fear lessens because all of a sudden they have more education on the problem that they are trying to solve because you helped them. So the motive here is going to be the most important thing. And where you're going to catch it is in the details. The motive has to be, I need to help this buyer. So I don't have to try any tactics out on someone if I truly want to help them. I'm going to diagnose the things they don't know in their current situation, so at minimum they have it. And then they come to me, hypothetically, right? If you've done your job appropriately. In a lot of cases, you're going to find that the problem isn't big enough. So if you find a misdiagnosis, something they believe that they need to buy, that they don't actually need to buy, you actually plummet your sale, but you help them in the end. By the timer, but I'm going to wrap it up with saying this. They're in motion. They're going to close. 35% conversion from inbound into closed one because they're already educated from what they know on the problem that they want to solve, and that the problem is big enough. People research upward of 20 data points. So like before they actually buy something, the last thing that they look at is a seller. And I hope that that hits everyone in the same way that it hits me. They're doing research on how to solve for it and the problem that they have to solve and what they need to do to solve it, not because they want to, but because they believe that at the end, they're going to be the one solely responsible and the only one that's there to be able to solve it. They're educating themselves because we haven't as sellers. So like the seller can't actually help me solve a problem. So because in my experience they can't, I have to educate myself. Because I can't, let's say I didn't hire a coach for my French, I have to self-educate. Because hypothetically, I didn't have someone that could help me. So the reason that motion is so sobering to me is we have pushed our buyer into a place where they feel like they have to self-educate because no one else is doing that for them. That's crazy. We should be the ones educating ourselves as the seller on their environment as a buyer so that we can be the one not to guide them through the buying decision or the buying process, but to guide them through the experience of, do they need anything at all? And what do they need to be prioritizing in solving for that? Patients come into the doctor all the time for a pain-related condition. And while the doctor has them there, they test for multiple things because they're like, while I have you here, I'm going to test for most things that aren't pain-related because typically people don't come in for tests that aren't pain-related. So like, I'm going to run a bunch of tests on blood pressure because no one comes in for blood pressure. But while I have them here, it's a win to me as a doctor because then I can catch things that they didn't know. And the only reason it's a win to the doctor is because their agenda and their goal is to find things that the person didn't know to help them. So my challenge to everyone today is that ours? Is that our goal? And if it is our goal, then we have to start reading. We have to start figuring out what our buyer does. We have to start researching the stats because it's either us or it's them that researches it. And if it's them, then they don't need me, right? But if it's me doing it, then I can learn 10x, 5x, whatever, the information. So I'm an actual asset to the buyer. So I'm not sitting here with, mirroring words and late night DJ radio voice, or detaching from the outcome, trying to make them feel like they can open up to me. I actually need them to get them to open up to me because there's something positive for them on the back end. So I would focus all my calories there of, how do I learn so much information about my buyer that I believe myself that it is a positive situation for me to be in that equation with them, because I'm scared of what happens to them if they're diagnosing themselves. It's not their job. It's my job. It's my responsibility. So I take this very, very heavily as a seller and as anyone who does any kind of content, that I lay in bed at night and think about. I'm like, okay, if there are things that are wrong in my content or there are things that are incomplete, then if someone gobbles that up and executes on it, and it wasn't correct, they would have been better off not watching a video of mine. So I have to study because I'm like, where are the holes? Where are the things that aren't correct? So that I can glean out as many of those as possible so that I'm positive that if they come into interaction with me, I'm more and more and more and more and more positive. And how I'm reassuring that is not by, what's the condition or that people talk about whenever they're like, imposter syndrome. I'm not trying to combat imposter syndrome by looking in the mirror and being like, hey, Becc, you can do this. Don't worry. You got it. Go out. Just read. That will take care of the imposter syndrome. It's become less and less and less and less of an imposter by learning more and more and more and more about them that they didn't know. So the problem that I had with French was not that I felt like an imposter. The problem I had with French is I was. I hadn't learned enough. I hadn't studied enough. I hadn't put in the time. I hadn't looked up conjugation. I hadn't looked up tenses. I hadn't looked up pronunciation. But the more and more I start to look at that process, the more and more I get corrected by my coach, the more and more he comes over. And it's somewhat of a painful process. But what's more painful is not speaking French in the end and then having to go hypothetically on stage in front of someone to help them speak French, right? So how you can get rid of all of that and really put your money where your mouth is of I'm becoming an expert for my buyer. I'm becoming helpful for my buyer because I'm learning things that they didn't know. We have 2 examples and we're going to move on. Let me see if anyone in the chat can guess. There's something that I didn't know. Jonathan, I don't want you to guess. But if I want to ask someone how you say, do you speak English or do you speak French? In French, I want to see if anyone can guess how you would say that. How have you been taught that you would say that? Can you speak English? Do you speak English or do you speak French? You can do either question. Let's see if anyone dings in here. They're like, Beck, you got too rainy today, so I went out. I'm gonna wait on this. That's one question. Yeah. So how would you say, do you speak English or do you speak French? D'accord, madame. He said, okay, I agree. Okay, mademoiselle. Okay, Kirsten, anyone else other than Jonathan? Be honest. How would you say, don't look it up, can't look it up. How do you think that you would say, do you speak English or do you speak French in French? How have you been taught since you were little, especially if you're an American? How would you say that in French? See if anyone can guess it. I am French. Can I participate? No, you cannot, Ibrahim. Désolé. Not for this exercise. Anyone who's non-French. So Lori pinged in here. Have you ever heard of it? Heard of like, how would you ask? What comes to your brain when you're trying? Yeah. Okay. Parlez-vous français? Okay. Here's a good start. So here's what's interesting. Okay. Here's what's very interesting. So I want you to look at how Min put in the chat and how Federico put in the chat. That's what we're taught is parlez-vous français, parlez-vous anglais. Every single time when we're in the US, we're taught to lead with the do you speak first. But if you'll notice, Jonathan actually speaks French. So they actually lead in every case with the vous parlez français, tu parles français. So they start with the you, the vous, or the tu. But in every single case, when I was learning it growing up, it's parlez-vous français, parles-tu français. So the point is that the reason this is a misdiagnosis that we believe in the United States, that's how you say, and techniquement, it's correct. But they never use it here. They always switch the order. They start with the vous or the tu. So you'll notice Jonathan jumped in the chat here and he started with the tu because he's French, he speaks French natively. So what are those things about your buyer that your buyer believes just because they were taught that way? They were taught that this thing is true that actually isn't true. So if I were to use parlez-vous in any case condition, they would understand me, but they'd be like, ooh, okay, non-native speaker. So what are those things that your buyers believe about their role? Yeah, Federico. Isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy? Another one is Eiffel Tower is not how they say it. It's Tour Eiffel. So there was a number of things. Here's another one that blew my mind, and then we're going to go into lap 4. Is I was like, so there's a noise that we all believe that French people make. I'm going to see if anyone can guess it. All American. So I had to mention it to a couple people who are French. I was like, well, there's a noise that we think that y'all make. It's a French noise. We always think is ha ha ha. So I had to explain this to my professor. He was like, what noise are you talking about? And I was like, the French noise. And he's like, what are you talking about? I was like, the one y'all make. And he was like, have you heard a French person make this noise? And I was like, interesting. I've been here for almost 2 years and I haven't. So I repeated the noise to him. And he was like, what the hell is that? He was like, we have no idea what you're talking about. He was like, have you ever heard a French person make this noise? I was like, never. He's like, have you ever, seen it on a show where a French person makes that noise? I'm like, no. And he's like, but Americans believe that we make this noise. I was like, correct. And he was like, why? I'm like, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I have no idea why. They have no clue what that noise is. So it's another misdiagnosis. The point is, how can you learn those things that if they were operating off of it, it's going to hurt them? They believe that it's parlez-vous. So how can you find out what those things are so that you can correct them? Okay, let's go into the last lap. Then we're going to close out. There's a number of different aha moments for me in French that I'm like, oh, never mind. Okay, Kirsten had a question here. What percentage of deals fall out because even your diagnosis doesn't find something that's big enough to move forward? Well, it depends. So if they're already in motion and you don't find something, yeah, I think that noise was in a cartoon in the 80s. I have no idea where it comes from. Neither do they. Not one French person have I met. They have any idea what that noise is or where it came from. So point being, what percentage of your deals fall out because your diagnosis isn't big enough? I wouldn't say that the root cause is ever that a deal falls out because your diagnosis wasn't big enough. Meaning a deal falling out means it was already in motion. So if it's already in motion, there was a problem that that was big enough for them to solve. The only case that I could think that it happens, and this is the point where you have to make a choice, and I absolutely lean in, and I'm telling you in the long term, it will make you slay your results. Even if I'm the most selfish seller that's just after, how do I close more quota? How do I go to President's Club? How do I smoke everyone on the board? It's diagnosing things you don't know. The only case that it will slow down, finding a misdiagnosis will slow down a buyer that's already in motion, is if they're in motion, but what they're in motion about is actually not a problem, not the problem at all. And so your solution was to solve the problem that they believed that actually isn't the problem that they should be solving for. So I'll give you an example, and then we're going to go into how to easily diagnose unknowns. The example is, and I covered this a couple days ago, but I went in to buy an Ethernet cable at Best Buy, an extender at Best Buy, because I was having lag issues when I was back in Texas on my Zoom. And so the extender, a COI seller would have tried to calculate the impact of what happens to me if I don't buy the extender. An ROI seller would have, said what the benefits are of buying the extender. A discount-based seller would have said, okay, I'm going to reduce the price of this extender. But the problem was, I didn't need an extender. An extender would have cut my internet usage in half. Thank goodness there was a guy who asked me the questions. He was like, what do you need it for? Can you describe to me why you need the extender? I was like, because my internet quality is cutting in half. Like I have, that I have several lags on my Zoom. And he was like, what kind of unit do you have today? I'm like, it's a mesh unit. They're here, here, and here. And all of a sudden he was like, you don't need an extender. If you were to use an extender, it would have cut your internet speed in half. You actually just need to move one of these mesh units close to your computer, and you need to plug in through an Ethernet cable. Do you have an Ethernet cable? I call my dad, and he's like, yeah, we already have one. So in this case scenario, actually, he evaporated the sale. But the really warming thing was he did it without even blinking, meaning his goal was to help me. I actually didn't need to buy an extender. That would have hurt me, not helped me. And so his goal is everything in this case scenario. So that's the only time diagnosing an unknown, finding a misdiagnosis, will actually slow the deal down. I personally am completely okay with that, because I'm like, that would have hurt me long term, right? So he, thank goodness, had my interests over his interests as a seller at heart. Because if he had had his interests as a seller at heart, he would have sold me that unit. And I would have used that unit. And when I would have found out that that wasn't the solution, that actually made the problem much worse, is during a live session with a brand new enterprise client with 150 people. So thank goodness he had my best interest at heart. So how to easily diagnose unknowns. So it's somewhat simple. Hi, Damon. Oh, Damon. That warmed my heart. Thank you for saying that, Damon. Really means a lot to me. How do you diagnose unknowns? So just find out, Google their leading, leaning, and lagging indicators. Just Google them. What are the KPIs of a facilities director? What are the KPIs of a, whatever your buyer is, marketer, procurement, legal ops, sales ops? That's step one. Everything online is usually going to be a leading indicator, not a lagging. But I would find out what those are. The second thing that I would do, if you want to take it an extra step further, is I would approach several people in that role who are not current buyers, because then they're going to start talking about how they use your solution. Just go to several people in that role. Once you have that list, go to several procurement leaders and ask them 4 questions. Which ones of these, if you're going to protect only one of these metrics, would you protect out of these ones that I've listed here? Whatever they pick as a lagging indicator. Which ones of these do you actually not care about at all? Which ones of these do you care about next after the lagging indicator? Which ones are incorrect that are on this list, and which ones need to be added? Then you have a list of accurate metrics. I would do that for 5 buyers if you want to be sure. 15 minutes who are not users of your current product. Once you have that list that you're like, okay, everyone in procurement was talking about this. Everyone in procurement was talking about compliance. Everyone in procurement was talking about discount rate. Then I would Google the industry averages of those metrics. What is the average discount rate that a procurement leader gets someone to discount? Then I would search. So that's step 3. Then I would search for at what rate do these usually cause a problem? Meaning, if the compliance rate is anything less than 80, it causes a problem. If the open rate is anything for a cold email is anything less than a 50, it's usually going to cause a business problem if they're missing quota. If the reply rate is anything less than a 10% reply rate, then it's usually going to cause a problem if they're missing quota, et cetera, et cetera. If they're converting anything into close one under 25%, then this on outbound, there's going to likely be a problem that they're missing quota. If they're eating any more than 2,500 calories per day, there's probably going to cause a problem with weight gain. And the last step is you just ask questions to those actual indicators for them in specific. How many calories are you eating? What's your open rate? What's your reply rate? What's your proactive versus reactive maintenance rate? So you can uncover in the room what are the things that are causing a problem that they didn't know about likely beforehand. Here's the last thing that I'll say. When you're doing that research, most people don't research their own role. Meaning most people, and I would ask myself, don't answer in the chat, but most people don't research like what's the average open rate of a cold email? What's the average conversion for inbound and outbound? How much quota attainment are sellers actually typically getting? How does it vary per industry? What's the no-show rate on a Monday versus a Friday for booked meetings? What is it in the morning versus the afternoon? How many calls are people on average making? How many connects does that actually yield? The only reason that I know those totals is not because I'm smart or a good person. It's because I looked them up. That I'm like, I need to find out what these are so I can at minimum give people a benchmark. So once you actually search for those totals, it's a much easier, you can add value faster than you think is what I'm after. Is just because you're not a CIO doesn't mean that you can't add value. It means you're a couple stats away and a couple bits of research away to find that out. So that's it for today. I'm thinking about the time when I met Jonathan and he was like, hey, do you want to speak in French? And he started in French and I was like, oh, he's too good. Never mind. I was like, no, English only. Thank you so much for today, for everyone for coming in. I had a wonderful time. This was day 12 of the Sales Olympics. So tomorrow, demain, we are going to be going into all the questions that you should never ask in discovery. It's going to be heated. I'm already heated thinking about the topic about tomorrow. So we're going to go into all the questions that you should never ask. Full disclosure, it's going to be like Family Guy. I'm probably going to offend everyone in the room. But know this, the reason I know all these questions, how bad they are, is because I've done them all. So people are like, how do you know so much, Becc? And I'm like, I've done every mistake that you could even imagine with the discovery, then cold call, etc. So tomorrow we're going to be going into all the questions that you should never ask. And the following day, we're going to go into all the questions that you should absolutely ask in discovery. So thank you so much for tuning in today. Federico, Damon, that was one of the nicest. That was so nice. Thank you for saying that in the chat. Really warmed my heart. I mean that. Justin, Kirsten, Lori, parlez-vous français? He's like, no, vous parlez français. Anyhow, I will see y'all tomorrow. So I'm going to be French. If French want to be cheesy, as always, Jonathan, don't judge me. I'm going to say à demain, à bientôt, merci pour tout, et au revoir pour maintenant. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Thanks so much for coming today. Au revoir.